Welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been a hell of a year, and if you've made it this far with your health and your sanity mostly intact, then you're doing well. I thought we all needed something nice to look forward to at the end of a year, and so I called upon some of my very talented friends and we put together this show for you, from our homes to yours. I only wish we could be doing this in person, but believe me, we'll be with you in spirit. Winter has long been associated with ghost and horror stories, and as this time of year, more than any other, is all about tradition, what a fine one to celebrate. In winter, the sun never rises as high, the shadows are longer. That walk home is a little scarier, a little less familiar. Home is more of a sanctuary than ever. We shut the curtains to keep out the dark and whatever may be watching us from within it, waiting for us to venture out again. Until we must do that, let's open a bottle of something nice and enjoy these stories.
This is an extract from my latest novel, The Wise Friend, published by Flame Tree Press. Patrick Semple's late aunt was a painter with a decided penchant for the surreal and the occult. In her later years, she appears to have visited various occult sites in England, and Patrick, for reasons of his own, not just because his son has become interested in these sites too, decides to visit some of them to see what is there. In this extract from a chapter called It Speaks, he visits Halfway Halt, an abandoned railway station in Yorkshire, and he's directed there by his sat-nav, as we are these days. Arrive at your destination. My helper couldn't change his tone, its tone to be accurate, and yet the direction felt peremptory, an assumption of obedience or of the lack of any choice. Ahead, the road ended at a towering metal fence encrusted with rust and quilted with ivy, and I thought the phone had misdirected me until I noticed a gap in the hedge to the left. Though branches bound with ivy were well on their way to closing the gap, it was the entrance to a car park. The deserted expanse was spread with ragged rugs of moss. Weeds sprouting from cracks in the concrete gestured in a wind that rattled scales of dead ivy on the outer wall of the abandoned railway station, which resembled an elongated single-storey cottage with a steep roof. Holes left by fallen slate honeycombed the roof, which poked three lanky chimneys and their blackened pots at a sky like a reminiscence of their sooty past. I parked near the station entrance, where double doors had lost their hold on the frame, sprawling face down on the concrete. As I slipped my phone into a pocket, having climbed out of the car, I appeared to rouse the navigator. "Arrived," it said. "I know that," I retorted, despite feeling less confident than I tried to sound. Through the exit from the waiting room beyond the doorless entrance, I could see a sign on the further platform. Black lichen or a vandal's paint spray had covered the name of the station, except for the first two letters of each word, Halfway Halt, so that the sign resembled a joke at the expense of any visitor. I wondered how my aunt had read it, though would it have been in this state when she was here? I didn't even know how long ago that was. Perhaps I would find some insight in the waiting room. The door to the platform had collapsed, and the windows overlooking it had been thoroughly smashed. At least this let in the daylight, such as it was, enabling me to pick my way around the rubble strewn across the floorboards. Tattered posters clung to the walls, portions of them groping at the shadows as a chilly wind enlivened them. The vintage posters advertised holiday resorts, bygone or certainly transformed since. One poster showed a family on a seafront, while the other placed a couple with their son and daughter on a beach. Of course, they must be different families, but somebody had gouged out every face and the plaster behind them, filling their outlines with wet red brick. The tattered silhouettes were growing restless with the wind, and I was reminded of the kind of seaside sideshow where customers paid to thrust their faces through the holes that grotesque figures had above their necks. Why should I imagine that all the holes in the posters were about to produce the same face? Just now I preferred to leave that kind of fancy to my aunt, and I made my way over to the booking office. At the foot of the grimy window a low arch gaped in the glass. Heavy wire mesh protected the aperture, putting me in mind of a church confessional I'd once seen in a film, but left a narrow gap above the sill for hands to reach through. Items encased in dusty cobwebs, a ledger, a pen, and a chewed stub of pencil, obsolete little machines, lay on the extended sill beyond the window. A fireplace stood in so much gloom that it appeared to lead into a deeper darkness than it should. Between the hearth and the ticket window, a small table bore a teapot divested of its lid. Weeds occupied the pot, though in the dimness they could have been taken for a version of a genie emerging from a lamp. Some sort of growth poked out from the lid beside the pot, as if a hermit creature had appropriated it for a home. I was about to move on when I glimpsed activity around an office chair lying on its back near the hearth. Several thin fingers were fumbling out from underneath, as if an occupant had been squashed flat, but was determined to return. The scrawny digits began to crumble, sending particles to swarm in all directions, and even when I realized that spiders were hatching under the chair, I found no reason to linger. I stepped onto the platform under the threat of a storm. Grass grew between the flagstones, twitching in the wind. Rotten, lopsided benches stood about in remembrance of commuters, and one knelt on its solitary left leg like a beast about to die. On the opposite platform more than one flagstone had been heaved up with the knotted limbs of an intruder, the roots of trees beyond an insecure brick wall, which the trees and branches were urging to collapse. Apart from the sign that suggested a birth of silent mirth, one remnant said, "Way Alt," another just, "Way." Perhaps this was the work of vandals, like the words sprayed or scraped on the mossy wall, mag and gist and tell and rum scattered along its length. No doubt the words meant more to their author than they did for the rest of the world, often the case with graffiti. They only helped to leave me increasingly unsure why I was there at all. The railway tracks had been removed. If anyone had planned to turn the route into a nature walk, the scheme had been abandoned before they'd taken up the sleepers. The overgrown board suggested stepping stones over a medium less solid than the ground they were embedded in. To my right they climbed between grassy banks to follow a ridge that was eventually blocked by fallen trees, while on my left the route descended into a cutting. My aunt had written something about the latter in her journal, and if I was to gain any insight from my visit, perhaps it would be there. I made for that end of the platform, where a slippery ramp led down to the remains of the track. While the sleepers were spaced closely enough to invite my stride, they looked precarious with lichen, and I walked beside the vanished tracks instead. In a few hundred yards the ruddy sandstone walls were higher than my head. I could have fancied I was descending into a past embodied in the strata of the exposed rock, or at least my aunt might have had such an impression. Trees perched on the edge above me, their contorted roots gripping the cracked stone. Patches of the walls bulged with lurid fungi, and other stretches were mottled with moss. About a quarter of a mile ahead, a road bridge crossed the cutting, and I was halfway to it when a voice spoke close to me. "In 300 yards, turn left onto Riders Lane." The walls must be distorting it, because it sounded untypically shrill. I thought I'd switch it off before pocketing the phone, but I made doubly certain now. Having stowed the phone again, I advanced to the bridge, where the arch was toothed with loose bricks. Its darkness closed over me as I glanced back. There was no sign of the station, just the artificial valley tapering into the distance. Of course, the perspective was hiding the platforms, not to mention narrowing the gap between the walls, as if the perilously tilted trees were urging them closer. Was this what my aunt had seen? She'd written something of the kind. I should have copied her journal onto my phone. I was still under the bridge when my companion said, "In a quarter of a mile, turn left to your destination." He sounded shriller than before, no doubt because of the acoustic, and I had the grotesque notion that he was about to change gender. "I'm there already," I informed him, and a voice that wasn't his said, "Ready," my echo from the arch. I muted the phone, shoved it in my pocket, and then I sat out from the bridge. Trees lead out further overhead as the downward slope grew steeper. Would my aunt have seen the blackened sky weighing them down? She might have thought the past, represented by the multiplying strata of the walls, was drawing us lower still. No doubt she would have appreciated how some of the set of bracket fungus on the walls resembled pairs of fleshy lips. She could have envisioned the large beads of moisture that clung to the lichen as lidless eyes, their blank stares following me through the gloom. Had I undergone enough of her kind of fancies yet? Although the wind seemed not to reach down here, I kept feeling colder. The trouble was I had no real idea of how she might have viewed the place, or how it might appear to my son. Surely there was nothing he ought to avoid, and why should I imagine there might be? I was still trudging down the slope when the land above the cutting emitted a moist whisper that progressed into a hiss as it closed in, and the branches overhead began to writhe as if they were struggling to fend off the storm. The nearest shelter was the bridge I'd left behind. As I sprinted for it, the ground underfoot grew treacherous. It must be soaking up the rain, even if I didn't yet feel drenched. It felt no more stable than a marsh, and I dodged onto the nearest sleeper and then the next one up. They weren't quite as close together as I'd assumed, and the slope was steeper than I was anticipating. Wasn't this often the case when you had to return uphill? I told myself so, while deploring the incompetence of the workmen who had laid the line, since the sleepers weren't evenly spaced. Indeed, each pair was a little further apart, and I was having to stride wider. I felt as I was striving to climb a ladder without being able to use my hands to clamber, and soon I had to jump from board into increasingly slippery board as outsized raindrops plummeted from the trees to thump my scalp. I tried walking on the ground instead, only to slither backwards. I could easily have fancied that I felt the ground shift underfoot, and I retreated onto the sleepers, lurching from one insecure foothold to the next. I'd missed my footing more than once, landing on the restlessly insecure earth by the time I stumbled under the bridge. I did my best not to think the shelter felt even slightly like a trap. The downpour must be weighing on the trees, which looked bent on dragging the rock walls together. The prematurely nighted sky appeared to have narrowed the cutting and blocked it in both directions with blackness closer than the railway station. I stood under the middle of the arch, beneath the untravelled road, and tried to be soothed by the incessant liquid murmur of the rain, rendered stereophonic by the bridge. I was finding reassurance in the inability of the storm to touch me, when I began to hear a voice. I snatched out my phone, but it stayed mute. For a distracted moment I wondered if I could be hearing an announcement at the railway station. Might someone be listening to a car radio nearby? I strained my ears to make out the voice through the downpour. It sounded almost as thin and as randomly shaped as the rain. Was it whispering "must" or "master"? No, there were more than two syllables, though not quite either of those. "Mist tells?" Not that, and I peered down the slope, where the sound almost indistinguishable from the rush of rain appeared to come from. Perhaps they were just part of the downpour, like the twin globules of water that swarmed down a patch of lichen to lodge above an especially prominent outcrop of fungus, two thick piebald ledges pressed together. The rain was rousing the plump fungoid strips, causing them to twitch apart and extrude a swollen greyish tendril like the relic of a tongue. The spectacle appeared to locate the whisper and then its substance. "Magister," I was almost sure it said. "Magister Stellarum." I tried to believe that only the rain was shifting the fungus, however allied to the syllables the movement seemed to be. Perhaps the movements were making me hear words where none were to be found. I couldn't help recalling when the left-hand globule either lost its hold or burst, streaming down the wall, to be followed at once by its twin. The fungus drooped as though exhausted by its efforts, and then I caught sight of another pair of globules that had come to rest above two lips of fungus, much closer to the bridge. Moisture eased the protrusions apart, and I heard the simulation of a voice. Magister Stellarum. The downpour was abating, and I could no longer mistake the voice for rain. It sounded soft as rotten fungus, and similarly liable to collapse. Although the wind had dropped, I was seized by a fierce chill. I couldn't move or look away from the unnatural activity on the wall until it fell apart, the watchful globules drooling down the lichen as the strips of fungus sagged. Ought I to have felt reassured? Not when I feared the presence was simply moving on and about to reappear. I held my breath until I had to gasp, but heard nothing beyond belated rainfall from the trees. The cutting had grown almost silent when I sensed movement overhead. My eyes were aching by the time I made out a swollen shape, like a bag stuck to the underside of the bridge. I thought its eyes were glinting darkly in the gloom, and other restless parts of it bore some resemblance to lips. Certainly, I heard the whisper, amplified by the echo, until it sounded as though the bridge was producing the words like a great stone mouth. It paralysed me in my thoughts, until a dreadful notion overtook me that the ill-defined object was about to relinquish its hold on the arch and drop on me like a huge swollen spider. Almost before grasping I had regained the ability to move, I fled. The whisper ceased at once, which only left me dreading where it might reappear. I thought I glimpsed unwelcome features starting to take shape here and there on the lichenous walls, which were streaming with the aftermath of the downpour. I fancied I heard attempts to pronounce syllables that had grown entirely too familiar, however meaningless. Tentative, almost liquid whispering behind, if not beside me, and once, far worse, ahead. The slope was gentle on this side of the bridge, but whenever I sensed a presence beginning to form close to me, I was overcome by a renewed chill, which drained my energy so much I almost couldn't lurch from sleeper to uphill sleeper. I had a wholly nightmarish fear that I might never reach the railway station, that somehow there was no longer one at halfway halt to reach. Far too belatedly the walls of the cutting gave way to the platforms, and at last I stumbled up the ramp towards the waiting room. My footsteps on the bare boards resounded so much that I doubted I would hear a whisper, and the room was too dark for me to make sure it was as empty as it had been. I was heading for the exit to the car park. Just a few more determined strides and I would be out beneath the restlessly black sky, when I hesitated, having been drained of momentum by another sudden chill. In the silence I heard surreptitious movement above me, where I could just make out a discoloured bulge in the plaster of the ceiling. It reminded me far too much of a cocoon, even before I heard its contents stir again. They weren't merely restless, they were mumbling blurred syllables, which I felt helplessly compelled to distinguish. As I peered at the wakeful shape, I saw the plaster start to crack, and was terrified that the contents would fall on my face. A convulsive shiver released me from my paralysis, and I dashed close to blindly into the car park. But that is only the end of that encounter.
Hello there, I'm Benjamin Langley. Thank you for tuning in to Winter Tales. I'm the author of 3 novels, Dead Branches, Is She Dead in Your Dreams, and Normal. Early in 2021, I'm going to be releasing a novella called The Fenwich of Goose for the Split. The story which you'll be listening to from me today is called Hands That Do the Devil's Work. This story came about while I was studying some Norse mythology, writing some lessons for school, and I came across the story of Loki's head and realised that Shakespeare had ripped off certain elements of that story for one of his plays, The Merchant of Venice, and I figured if it's okay for Shakespeare to rip it off, it's okay for me to borrow elements too. I hope you enjoy the story, and thanks for tuning in.
Welcome, welcome. Take a seat. How do you like the feel of that sofa? It's a Danelli Italia. I could have gone for something a little more expensive. I was tempted by the genuine alligator leather. But they say the Danelli, it's like you're sitting on a cloud. I can see it on your face, I'm not wrong, am I? Some say that's as close to heaven as you can get. What do you say? How does it feel? Can you put it into words? Many can't. They sit there and they tell me the luxury is indescribable. Ha! Indescribable. Would you like a drink? I have a bottle of 50-year-old Balvenie single malt, by all accounts exquisite. Hugo, bring our guest a glass of the Balvenie. No, nothing for me. Did you enjoy the scenery on your approach? The coastal path offers a great view over the cliffs and to the sea. If you're quiet for just a second, and if you listen closely, you can hear the waves crashing against the rocks. It was that sound that brought me here, that's kept me here all these years. Of course, I miss the hubbub of the city, but I'm capable of working from home. I guess I have to. And I take it that's why you're here. You know my reputation. Guy that tore up contracts. If you wanted out of a bad deal, I was your man. I led many a client merrily through the loopholes and out the other side, significantly better off than when they started. Whether that was a mismatched marriage or a bad business deal, I was the one that set people free. And with bigger wins came bigger contracts, multinational organisations wanting out of their environmental obligations, clauses invoked to stop huge bonus payouts to front of house workers, revoking protection on areas of natural beauty. No contract is entirely watertight. That's what I used to tell my clients. But these days I write the contracts. Maybe I could have used my talent in a more socially conscious way. If I'd have done that, I doubt I'd be here now. I certainly wouldn't have had the same reputation. And my reputation led Randolph Price to me, and without Randolph Price, I never would have ended up in this house. Let me tell you about Price. As soon as he entered my office, I could see the anxiety dripping from his brow, could hear it in the quiver of his voice, and as soon as he dropped the contract on my desk, I knew I was dealing with something quite unlike anything I'd ever handled before. The leaves of the paper, oddly beige, did not sit together as one would expect, curling away from each other as if each page were disgusted by the words on the next. "What is this?" I said, looking Price in the eyes. He'd made his appointment by phone and had given me very few details about the deal he wanted out of. Naturally, I did my research before our appointment. Price was the very epitome of privilege. Privately educated at the very best schools, handed property when he turned 24, and sent out into the world armed with the security of a hatful of stocks and shares. All this was soon frittered away with a series of poor investments and business ventures steeped in failure. Having sold his property, he looked like he was going to be bankrupt by the time he was 30. But then he turned it around. His luck on the stock market completely changed, and he found a knack for buying low and selling high, and the software companies he started up found success and huge profits with their every endeavour. But before me, Randolph Price, on the eve of his 40th birthday, looked the very picture of a broken man. In the images I'd seen online, Price looked a well-groomed gentleman, never a hair out of place and always immaculately dressed. In my office, he was unshaven, unwashed, unkempt. It was clear that the contents of the contract troubled him deeply. "Whatever the problem is, Mr. Price, I can help," I'd said, hoping to set him at ease. I disliked the thought of him shedding hair on my carpet through his anxiety. I liked the idea of him sweating through his suit onto the Fritz Hansen Oxford Premium Office chair even less. The thought of skimming through the contract while he excreted onto my furniture was too unnerving, too distracting. If only he would give me a précis, I could begin to work my mind before I delved into the finer details of the wording of the contract. Price stared only at the floor, muttering something incomprehensible. "Okay, Mr. Price. First, tell me what it is that you don't want to lose." Price looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, livid with fear, and when he spoke, it was in a voice that could barely carry the weight of words. "My hands!" He held them out before me, trembling. I glanced at the contract. Surely its terms did not dictate that he must pay the price with his hands, but I could not for the life of me understand what it could mean figuratively. "Tell me, Mr. Price, with whom did you come to such an agreement?" I asked. He spoke in a whisper, and at first I thought he'd said cushion, and I was ready to sling him out of my office. While he'd promised me millions if I could save him from the terms of his contract, I had no time for one as irrational as he. If only I had. "I'm sorry," I said. He spoke louder. "With Guchon, a duke from hell." Price held his hands at face height. "He wants my hands." I picked up the contract. It was all I could do to keep hold of it, for the coarse feel of the paper revolted me. It was some kind of pale leather, and the pages were stitched together with a thick brown fibre. I turned to the back page, each contract sending an unpleasant prickling sensation from my nerve endings all the way up my spine. But I persisted to see the signatories. There, in crude, dirty brown letters, the name Price had given me. Guchon. Initially, I thought that this had to be either some kind of practical joke or that the man was deranged. It was one of those moments when I was truly lost for words, and believe me, you don't get all of this if you can't talk a good game. Price, though, filled the silence for me, staring with intensity, his whole body shaking. "Ask him a question, and Guchon sees all. He controls 45 legions of demons, and tells all past, present, and future things." I remembered my research, how close Price was to ruin. Was this sudden reversal in fortune as a result of his bargain? "You signed a contract with a demon?" I asked. He grimaced. "I was at rock bottom. What else was I supposed to do? For 10 years he has guided my every move. But the contract is shortly due to expire, and I must pay the price." "And the price is your hands? Why your hands?" "He says he needs more hands to do the devil's work." Price wept. "My hands!" "Leave this with me," I said, "and I shall be in touch within 24 hours. Don't worry, Mr. Price, I've yet to find a contract I can't find a way out of yet." At the time, that was very true. I had a process, read from cover to cover, quickly at first to understand what had been promised. If necessary, I would talk to involved parties to confirm whether the promise of the contract had been delivered in full. Those were often the easiest outs, but it was clear in this case that Price was indeed given what he'd asked for: information on investments that would lead to significant profits. In return for this, it stated, after a period of 10 years, you will surrender the entirety of both of your hands. The contract was well written, which was to be expected, for if there was any profession well represented in hell, it was law. But it was only a matter of time before a drip of liberty dropped from the pages. I called Price and told him I had a way out, and that I would need to meet with him and this Duke from Hell to formalise the termination of the contract. The next day, the eve of his 40th birthday and the 10-year anniversary of the signing of the contract, Randolph Price arrived at my office. He had put on a new suit, one less drenched in sweat, and he'd shaved. "Are you sure this is going to work?" he said. I urged him to sit. "Trust me." I see you've finished your drink. Would you like another? Or I have an exquisite port, the 1985 Smith Woodhouse Vintage. Hugo! Another drink for our guest. Where was I? Price. Once he was seated, I asked him to summon his demon, this Gusion, and before my very eyes, from the corner of my room, a rectangular shape materialised. It started with a glow before the lick of flames formed the shape of a door. As it opened, a figure smaller than an average man emerged. When he got down on all fours and started to move towards us, I realised that this indeed must be Gusion, for once more I had done my research and discovered his name in an ancient text, the Lesser Key of Solomon. The information there corresponded with what Price had revealed, and also stated that he took the form of a baboon, which I saw before me. Once he was close, I could see the hideous effect of a lifetime among the flames of hell, for his tail was blackened and singed, and on one side of his proboscis was the scar of a burn, swirling the flesh, leaving it smooth in some places, wrinkled in others, casting one side of the face in a permanent sneer. He spoke in a high voice, but one steeped in authority. "It is time, Price, to pay for your decade of fortune. Come." With a swing of his arm, he ushered us to follow him, and returned through that magical entrance. Through the open door, the fires of hell glowed, and the screams of the damned echoed. And yet, I stood with confidence, contract in hand, ready to go through and argue the logic of my case. As soon as we were on the other side, the door disappeared, not so much as in a puff of smoke, but in a cloud of it. And while I trusted my process, I felt fear gnawing at my innards. The room beyond the door resembled a courtroom, albeit one decimated by fire and decorated with glistening bone. The gallery was filled with vile, red-skinned beings, perhaps once human, or denizens born of hell itself. Their demented wails filled the room as we followed Gusion, who positioned himself on the left, so naturally I led Price to the other side, through the open doors, at the back of the chamber, accompanied by the sound of trumpets wielded by bedraggled creatures, charred flesh flaking from their bones, entered a winged creature, almost angelic in form, but bearing every sign of evil epitomised. Gusion leant forward. "You have sought the representation of an expert, as your right, Price. As is mine, I call upon Lucifer, Lord of the Netherworld, Master of all demons, to preside over court. Now, let this so-called expert of yours speak." I nodded towards Lucifer, and I have to admit that at this point I felt more than a little out of my depth. The corners of his mouth turned up into a sinister smile, and he allowed his blackened wings to stretch out behind him to reveal the extent to which the bones were broken. His skin radiated a glow, as if he revelled the pain and the memory of the fall it evoked. But if there is one thing that is true of demons, even the Lord of all demons, it is that while they are deceptive and manipulative, they are true to their word and would never break the terms of a contract. I had to have faith in the words on the page and my ability to interpret them truthfully. I have read the contract. I paused for a moment, not quite knowing which form of address to use before settling upon something appropriate given his status. Your Highness, and indeed it does state that Gusion may take the hands of my client. The baboon demon showed his teeth with a cruel smile, and I turned slightly to catch Price's reaction, witnessing the last of the colour drain from his face. I invite you to take, as it states, both hands in their entirety, I said, gesturing towards Price. Lucifer snapped his fingers together, and a cleaver materialised on the desk in front of Gusion. Upon seeing it, Price tucked his arms behind his back. I continued. I must warn you, however, that the terms of this contract are very clear. You must take both hands, but you may not take so much as a slither of the wrist. Should you take so much as a thread of tendon, or the tendon sheathes, or spill so much as a drop of the fluid from the bursae, then you will be in forfeit of the contract. And should you decide to be cautious in your approach, and leave so much as a hint of the hand on the wrist, you will also be in forfeit of the contract, for it states that you must take both hands in their entirety. Now, go ahead. Chop away. Price continued to hold his hands behind his back, his face a picture of such abject terror. I turned to him. Trust me, I said, and slowly he withdrew his hands and placed them on the desk. Gusion took hold of the cleaver. Moving on 3 limbs and wielding the weapon above his head, he hurried to our table and carefully examined Price's trembling hands. As Gusion continued his study, the demonic crowd looked on, thirsty for bloodshed, their palpable excitement audible through the single unified heartbeat that singled the passing seconds. After scrutinising Price's hands from every possible angle, Gusion gave out a yelp of frustration and walked away, shaking his head. Lucifer, he said, I fear I already know your answer. Is it possible? The King of Demons shook his head. Then I concede. You know it is impossible to remove the hands without some kind of damage to aspects of the wrist. Upon his death, when he is only bone, I shall take what is owed to me. Then we are agreed that my client is free to go, I said. Lucifer raised a finger. Gusion, he said, it is correct that you know all future things. Is that true? Insofar as when I am asked a question, I can see the answer, even if it lies at some distant time. Then before we let our friend go, I have a question for you. Gusion smiled a cruel smile, revealing his sharp canines. Go ahead. Will our friend, the master of contracts here, return to us one day? Gusion looked directly at me and laughed, and soon his laugh was echoed by that of Lucifer, followed by the cruel laughs of the demon trumpeteers and the members of the galley. The door through which we'd arrived reappeared, still edged with flame, and I couldn't get through it quick enough, covering my ears as Price followed. On the other side, back in my office, I could share none of his joy. It was clear to see the relief on his face, but I was deaf to his words, the laughter of demons still ringing in my ears, laughter that continued wherever I went, following me both indoors and out, so that I couldn't work, but at night it was always worse, echoing around my head, denying me sleep, torturing me. I had to get away. I had to find solace somewhere. It was Price that put me onto this place. And with what he'd paid me, I had more than enough for a house like this, right by the sea, where the sound of the waves drowned out the sound of the laughter. When I came here, I found peace. Ha! It was almost as if they weren't laughing anymore. And that's when I made my fatal mistake. I signed the contract without reading every single word. I assumed it was just like every other property contract I'd signed, and in truth it was, with the exception of just a couple of clauses. As I said, when in the house, I was deaf to the laughter of demons, and as such, I was keen to move in as early as possible. But on that first night, as I climbed into my bed, a 6,000 Spring Majesty, and my head hit the luxury Hungarian goose-down pillows, the laughter echoed once more, followed by the words, "You're mine." And when the laughter stopped, I couldn't feel the softness of the pillow or the fine thread of the sheets. I climbed out, and as I did so, a gust of wind, from where I do not know, for the windows were closed, blew something from the dresser. It was the contract. It had fallen open on the 13th page, a clause circled in red ink. While occupying the house, the purchaser will be unable to experience the sensation of taste or of touch, and upon leaving the house, or death, the purchaser will immediately become the property of Lucifer. So as you sit in my luxurious chair, I urge you to enjoy the texture of the fabric, the way that it hugs your figure. If you have words that can describe that simple pleasure, please share them. And drink my drink. And just a simple word to share your experience will be greatly appreciated, for I can experience none of it. It brings me such misery that at times I am tempted to end it all. Only I know what waits for me at the end. And that's not all, for there was one more clause inserted into that contract, one of which I'm sure you're aware, the one that brings you to me today. While living in the premises, the occupier must carry out work on behalf of Lucifer or his legion. So I built my reputation as the man who gets others out of dodgy contracts, and I once believed that no contract was watertight. Now here I am. It's my hands that do the devil's work, writing contracts for the likes of you, contracts that allow you to prey on the weak and the needy, harvest their limbs and their organs once you've rendered your services, contracts that you and I know there's no getting out of. But if I have nothing else, I still have my professional pride. So tell me, what do you need?
They say that truth is stranger than fiction. I'd say that my fiction is often an attempt to tidy up the truth. All of my stories have a real-life starting point and sometimes a combination of actual occurrences. The world is a mysterious place and becomes even more so the closer you look at it, in the right places and with the right frame of mind. I have neither the time nor the temperament to convince other people that ghosts exist. But I've seen enough to convince me that they exist. He was beginning to wish he'd stayed at home. As Walker stepped off the train onto an unfamiliar platform, thunder rumbled like a celestial laugh at his expense, and he wondered if things could get any worse. He'd only just set off on the 2-hour journey back home when the train had ground to a halt, and for 20 minutes left him none the wiser with a damp chill eating into his bones, and a view of some rather sorry-looking trees stooping towards the train as if they sought some kind of shelter from a downpour. At last, an announcement came. The train would be going no further. It would leave him at the next station, and from there he would have to wait for a connecting service. There had been some kind of disruption on the main line. Soaking wet through and with a mood that had gone from furious to near martyrdom over the course of the day, Walker watched the stubby train pull away from the platform and disappear amidst the dripping trees. Of course, he would be the only passenger. At least this platform had a waiting room, and he'd have it all to himself. He slung his camera and his backpack over his shoulder and marched over to it. The door, flaking red paint and frosted glass, opened stiffly, exhaling a fetid blast of stale air, and worse. Musing on mankind's inexplicable desire to piss in any kind of enclosed public space, he stepped inside and allowed the door to drift shut behind him. There was an overhead light, though it was so grimy and full of dead flies that it seemed only to highlight the gloom. The walls were painted green, as if to bring the foliage in here. Perhaps that was why everything looked so damp and unappealing. Metal benches that looked only slightly more comfortable than standing lined the walls, and he sat himself down in the furthest corner, facing the door. There were 2 small windows, one either side of the door, but the glass was milky and blind as a cataract. Anything beyond vague shadows and a general idea of a daylight or lack of it would be impossible to discern. There was a further strip of windows running across the back wall, though these had no doubt been intended for ventilation, as they were 7 feet from the floor, very narrow and also of frosted glass. Disuse had sealed them shut. All in all, he was unpleasantly closed in. The only diversions were a newspaper that was probably at least weeks old, that was scattered across the floor and trodden into a soggy pulp, and a no smoking notice that somebody, or various somebodies, had touched up with cigarette burns. He'd better check on the time of the next, for all he knew, the only train. In here he'd never see anything coming. He set his belongings down on the bench and walked back out into a drizzle to confront the timetable. Thunder snarled. Rain sliced at the platform. Walker stared at the timetable until it made sense. The train that would take him a third of the way home was still another 40 minutes away. Feeling temporarily numb to any more unpleasant news, he stumped back into the waiting room. If anything, it seemed colder in here than it had done outside, but he'd had more than enough of the rain for today. It had come quite literally out of blue. The sky had darkened so quickly he'd thought something wrong with his eyes. Then the clouds had grown too heavy and split wide open to drench the countryside. He was foolishly prepared for walking. His jeans had turned black from the soaking, and his coat had lost whatever waterproof qualities it might have had some years ago. He'd taken the opportunity of what he'd thought a fine, clear day to travel out and take some photographs and notes for a book he'd been intermittently working on about the English countryside whenever his job allowed him the free time. By the time he'd made his way out of the forest, across the lake by ferry and up the long road to the train station, he felt drenched not only by the rain but by the pitying and amused looks he was receiving. Was that somebody else out on the platform? He raised his face towards the door as he listened, but there was only the wind sweeping by outside with a mournful cry, rattling the doors and windows in the frames. Anything that followed could only have been leaves and twigs cast by the wind. It sounded far too insubstantial to be people. Walker checked his watch and tried to calculate how long it might take him to reach home now. There was no point. He was only familiar with the times of a direct service. He knew only that he would get home very late. The thought weighed on his mind like an extra layer of dampness. His clothes felt as though they had been pasted to his skin. Somebody laughed, and he glanced back up at the door just in time to see a shape as thin as a bundle of sticks hurry by outside. What nonsense! He'd only just been out on a platform, and it had been as bleak and lonely as he was starting to feel. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. Another of his frustrations was that he'd neglected to pack a lunch, intending to round off the day in a pub somewhere with an open fireplace, plenty of food and a bottle of wine. The rain had chased him away from any such relaxation and washed him up here. It drummed on the roof like fingers, hissed like snakes in the woods. It trickled down his clothes and made him sneeze. The noise, loud and unexpected as a gunshot, echoed from the walls of a waiting room and dislodged others. Wasn't there a voice just beyond the window and a reply that sounded more like sobbing? He tried to concentrate upon his own thoughts of getting home, a warm, dry bed. Whatever was going on outside needn't concern him. He thought back over his day in the forest above the lake. Pleasant enough walk before the rain came down, and he managed to take a few good shots before the darkness had swept in over the mountains. His thoughts were going round in circles. He became aware that he was trying and largely failing not to listen to whoever or whatever was outside the waiting room. Why should it concern him? Whatever it was had fallen quiet again anyway, leaving only the hiss of the rain, the occasional lament of the wind and the low complaint of the thunder. With a sigh, he looked up from the floor just as a group of shadows swept across the windows, just clouds. They hadn't enough substance to be much else. The waiting room was growing darker by the minute around him, burying him in musty shadows. His thoughts were becoming increasingly despondent, little surprise in his current circumstances, but there was more than that. It was as though, since he'd arrived here, the storm had brought about a darkening of his spirits, as well as the end of a pleasant day. As though it was blowing an ill wind from further down the tracks. Beyond the unpleasant odours of a waiting room, he thought he could detect the odour of something else. It wasn't the scent of rain, nor of a damp and dripping vegetation. There seemed to be something burning, or burnt, nearby. Despite himself, but before he could rein in his imagination, he wondered about the nature of the disruption on the main line, and at that moment, a charred and blackened figure flattened itself against the window. Walker thrust himself backwards against the bench, cried out before he could help it. The figure against the window, however, seemed to be nothing more than wind-swept leaves from the forest, for the next gust scattered it into fragments and left the window filled only with a fading daylight. Though he tried to laugh at the illusion, his heart was pounding, and the start it had given him left him feeling queasy. More leaves, twigs or litter blew along the platform outside, scraping like claws. The burnt smell seemed closer. He must hope that this would not bring any further delay to his journey. He allowed himself to settle back against the hard metal of a bench and tried to ignore how it pressed the remnants of dampness from his clothes deeper into his skin. He stared at the floor until he began to doze, and then pulled himself upright with a lurch. This was neither the time nor the place to sleep, as much as he suddenly felt like it. He didn't dare to imagine the night that lay in wait for him if he missed this train. He wished he'd brought a book to read, something to keep himself from falling into the long, dark spaces that were growing like fungus in his mind. He wished for some company at least, but when he heard footsteps on the platform outside, he just as quickly regretted his wish. They were rushing to get out of the rain, of course, and only the puddles could make the footsteps sound so sodden and squelching. But the haste seemed far too eager. There was something unpleasant in the scrambling gait, and Walker found himself holding his breath and unable to release it until long after the steps had faded away. If there had indeed been somebody out there, then they'd gone back into the rain, but he suspected he'd been mistaken about the nature of a presence, after all. He hadn't thought it possible to feel so alone and yet watched. If he was being watched, though, he couldn't imagine where from. The windows were turning black as smoke as the evening aged. Perhaps it was only the threat of a dream, for sleep seemed to be spreading across him like damp. He almost closed his eyes and surrendered to it. This sudden weariness made him feel strangely dissociated from his body. What must that be like, he thought, to suddenly lose your body? He thought of a consciousness, or those of many, wrenched free from suits of flesh and blood all of a sudden. Some would be scared by the experience, some distraught, others driven insane. For some, it would be too fresh to come to terms with. He jerked awake. What was he thinking? Souls grieving for themselves and lost in the night? He felt gripped by panic, but only about how much time he'd let pass, for already it was pitch black outside. Surely he'd have heard the train. He couldn't be left out here overnight with what? It was all right, he told himself, but he only meant for time. There was still 15 minutes before the train was due. There was a formless lowing sound from out of the forest that could have been a train's horn, but was more likely just the wind, and yet which did not sound like either. He shivered, and then he sneezed, which helped him to believe that the shiver was merely caused by the damp. It was strange, though, that he no longer felt quite as cold as he had done earlier. In fact, there was something warm about the waiting room now. He glanced sharply up at the high windows, thinking that he'd seen movement beyond them. The trees, of course, as what he'd thought he'd seen, had been black and twisted, and yet now he could see only an unpleasant pale smear across the glass, which he was sure hadn't been there before. It looked as though something had been thrown or pressed itself against the glass and slid away, leaving bits of itself behind. As he was staring, thunder muttered, and something reared up into sight behind the smear. He could tell himself several reasons why what he was seeing could not be a face. The window was too high. There was nothing on that side of the building but dripping leaves. It looked like something incomplete trying to be a face, but none of them reassured him in the least. They only made the apparition more horrific, and then, with a laugh that sounded like the crackle of fire, it melted back to the darkness. He threw himself to his feet, though he was far from certain what he wanted to do. He couldn't head outside into the dark and the rain, trapped on a deserted platform, whilst whatever was out there clambered across the building like a giant spider. Was there more than one of them? He had heard voices, or something like voices earlier, and sounds that had no words amongst them, only raw emotion. Perhaps thinking about them was as much of an invocation as was needed. For here came another of them, clambering up the adjacent wall to press a face he was glad he couldn't see better against the filthy glass. And now he was surrounded by sounds from outside, furtive whispers, mocking laughter, and what he hoped were only branches scraping across the roof. Standing in the middle of a waiting room, Walker began to turn slowly, his gaze roaming across the door and each of the windows. They were as fleeting as shadows cast by fire and brought with them the smell of smoke. His mind felt pressed with unwelcome thoughts, some of which he was less able to hold back than others. He imagined the waiting room going up in flames whilst he was trapped inside. Was that what they wanted to do to him? As soon as he opened his mind to what was going on in theirs, he pictured flames, huge walls of fire, choking smoke, white-hot flames reaching out to claw at him as he screamed helplessly for his life. This was ridiculous. Where were such thoughts coming from? Just like the damp blanket of hopeless despair he'd felt earlier, they seemed to have blown out of the forest with the wind and the rain, blown like a scrap of litter or a charred leaf to wash up on the platform. Perhaps if that's all they were, then he was safe inside. If all they were was a surge of unfortunate emotion blown away from whatever tragedy had overtaken them, then these four walls could shelter him as effectively as from the wind and rain. He turned on his heels as something bumped against the high windows. Another face, though it was more like a mask, because he could have sworn there was nothing behind its eye sockets, and as it moved away after leering at him, it appeared to leave something more than smears on the glass. He couldn't stay in here forever, or even until more of a night came. He would be driven out of his mind with fear, not knowing exactly what he had to be afraid of just made it all the worse. The train would be here soon. It had to be here soon. They couldn't leave him out here all night. And then, he questioned himself, when it comes, what then? Much as he wanted to get away from this place, Walker could not bring himself to think about opening the door and stepping outside. Could that be the train now? Certainly there was a light playing on the glass of the door, becoming increasingly brighter, and a sound beyond the ragged chorus of sobs and whispers that could have been a soft roar. But if anything, the effect was more like that of fire. The light was not steady, it danced and flickered, and more than ever there was the smell of something horrendously burned, or burning, just outside. If the emotions he'd been sensing were coming from elsewhere, then the overwhelming fear that he was feeling might not be entirely his own, and he mustn't let it stop him from getting to the train. He closed his hand upon the door handle, though didn't know whether to wrestle it open or to hold it shut, when he felt something working against it from the other side. They were afraid, that was all, but people in a state of fear could be dangerous. Perhaps all the more so when they were dead. The light from outside was throwing the most unpleasant shadows across the panes of glass just inches from his face. Twisted forms appeared to dance, but only in the way that flames did. Fingers that might have been every bit as black as their silhouettes clawed at the glass. He heard the voices, laughing, weeping, pleading, snarling, but he couldn't allow himself to listen, for somewhere beneath it all, the omnipotent rumble of a thunder, he could hear the train. Walker allowed no time for second thoughts. He forced his weight down upon the door handle and spilled out onto the platform. It ought to be cold, but it was unthinkably hot. It ought to be dark, but there was a flickering luminescence. In the split second before he squeezed his eyes shut, he saw only enough to haunt his dreams forevermore, and yet not enough to be certain of exactly what he'd seen. Before the train dragged itself from out of the forest and frightened them away, he felt them too, and in some ways that was as bad as seeing them had been. They gripped him with fingers that crumbled like charred wood, caressed his face with a touch like dry leaves. Perhaps they'd used the forest to patch themselves together again, for when he opened his eyes to struggle into the carriage as the train lurched to a halt, he found himself wading through a good deal of leaves and mulch that had blown in with him. As though eager to be out of the woods, the train was moving before it even collapsed into a seat. The carriage was empty, as was what he could see of the next one through the door at the end. The gloomy lights flickered fitfully. He caught sight of his reflection in the window and turned away with a cry. It wasn't so much the sight of his disembodied face seeming to float through the forest alongside the train. It was the host of others that surrounded it, out there in the night.
Hello, I'm Mark Morris, and this is my contribution to Winter Tales. I'm going to read you a story from my new collection, which is called Warts and All, which is a 30th anniversary collection spanning my 30 years as a professional writer. I think I'm going to take the dust jacket off because it's easy to handle, because it's a very thick book. And this is a story called A Girl Sitting, which was published online in, let me just check, don't know if it'll say actually, I think it was published online around about 10 years ago, something like that. It does actually say 2013, so 7 years ago. So this is called A Girl Sitting. The screech of pneumatic drills, men shouting, scaffolding, rubble, mud. It might look like the Somme now, Dunbar said, but in 3 months it'll be paradise. What's the Somme? Asked Diane, jiggling 1-month-old Abigail on her hip. Matt sighed and preceded his wife and Dunbar into the house. If Diane had her way, and she usually did, then this would become their first proper family home. For the past 3 years, Matt and Diane had rented a pokey flat above the Chippy on Dean Street in the city centre. Now she wanted to relocate to this new development in the suburbs, put a deposit down and move in before the magnolia white emulsion had barely had chance to dry on the walls. Matt would have preferred something older, something with character, something that wasn't a clone of its neighbours, but he also wanted a quiet life, and he knew the only way to get one was to accede to Diane's requests. Once inside, he didn't bother waiting for Diane and the estate agent to catch him up. He wasn't interested in Dunbar's ideal home spiel, or of adopting the role of nodding dog in the wake of his wife's squealy enthusiasm. The house as it stood, half-finished and empty, was currently little more than a box divided into a series of echoey spaces, and therefore, in his estimation, nothing to get excited about. The rooms were of a regular size and shape. There were no cubby holes, no quirky nooks and crannies, no surprises whatsoever. The place felt cold and smelled of fresh paint and damp plaster. His footsteps echoed hollowly off the walls. By the time Diane, encouraged by Dunbar, was getting all orgasmic over the waste disposal unit in the gleaming new kitchen, Matt had drifted upstairs. He stuck his head around the bathroom door, noting its white sink and bath, its corner shower unit, all nice and neutral. The first of 3 bedrooms overlooked what would eventually be the back garden, but for now was a churned-up battlefield. Matt gave it a cursory glance and stepped back onto the landing. As he heard Diane and Dunbar clumping upstairs, he ducked quickly into bedroom number 2 to avoid Dunbar's banal patter. There was a girl sitting on a chair against the far wall. Matt jumped, not because the girl evoked fear, but simply because her presence was so unexpected. She was sitting silently and perfectly motionless, her hands on her knees, a distracted expression on her face. She was 11 or 12, dressed in an anonymous brownish dress with white collar and cuffs. Her mousy hair was braided into plaits, which brushed her shoulders. "Hello," Matt said. She didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Her eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere to his left. "Are you supposed to be here?" Matt asked. And then, "What's your name?" The girl stayed silent. Matt felt a little uneasy, which in turn made him feel foolish. He walked slowly towards the girl, his feet clumping on bare floorboards. "Are you all right?" he asked, because he was less than 2 meters from the girl when she disappeared. Matt blinked, sucking in air so quickly that it felt fishbone sharp in his throat. For a moment he wasn't sure what had happened. It was almost as if his attention had been diverted for a split second, during which the girl had taken the opportunity to slip away. He gaped at the spot where she had been sitting, and even stepped forward to waft his hand through the space. He felt tingly, hot and cold at the same time, and his heart raced. Had she been a ghost? Had he just had an honest-to-God supernatural experience? Mouth dry, he took a few stumbling steps back into the centre of the room, and the girl reappeared, hands on her knees just as before, silent and motionless on her wooden chair. Matt began to shake, but before he could decide what to do, the door opened, and Dunbar led Diane into the room. "And this is a second bedroom," the estate agent said, waving his hand extravagantly as though scattering seeds. "Oh, this is mint," said Diane. "This is definitely going to be the nursery. What do you reckon, Matt?" Matt couldn't reply. His throat felt as if it had narrowed to the circumference of a pencil. Diane frowned. "What's the matter with you? You look like a retard." Matt still couldn't speak. He could only point at the girl. Diane and Dunbar followed the direction of his finger. As if speaking to a slow-witted child, Diane said, "Yes, we call it a wall." Glancing at Dunbar, she raised her eyebrows. "Sorry about this. My husband's not usually such a mong." Matt's eyes widened. Could they not see what he was seeing? Evidently not, which could only mean that he was either psychic or hallucinating. "I see dead people," he thought, and felt a sudden urge to laugh like an idiot. With an effort, he swallowed the urge, which released his voice. "Sorry," he said. "Massive spider. It's gone now." 3 months later, they moved in. Matt didn't go into the second bedroom until the removal men had left and Diana was installed on the settee in front of loose women, Abigail sucking greedily on her nipple. The upstairs landing was quiet, quieter than it had been 3 months ago, now that the carpets were down. Diane had chosen the carpets. Blue downstairs, pink up here. Matt had hated the pink, but she had insisted. Just as she had insisted on the mini glass chandelier in the front room. Just as she had insisted on the new flat-screen TV, which Matt had spent the last hour installing and tuning in so that she wouldn't miss her soaps. And just as she had insisted on moving here in the first place, despite his protestations. Matt had tried everything to change her mind. He had told her that the house was too small, that the building firm had a reputation for shoddy workmanship, that all the decent schools were outside their catchment area, that there was a high crime estate not more than a mile away. But his words had fallen on stony ground. Not only had Diane refused to listen, but as usual she had shouted him down, ridiculed and reviled him. If it hadn't been for Abigail, he sometimes thought. But no, he had made his bed and it was his duty to lie in it. Hadn't his parents drummed into him the importance of always making the best of things? So here he was, once again standing outside the door of bedroom number 2, the room that Diane insisted was going to be the nursery. He listened. Aside from the blur of chatter from the TV downstairs, he could hear nothing. The lack of noise reminded him that they were the first to move into the estate, that the houses surrounding them were silent and empty. Bracing himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The girl in the brown dress was sitting on her chair against the wall. Matt's heartbeat quickened. His mouth went dry. The girl was just as she had been 3 months earlier, silent and motionless, gazing abstractedly at a spot just beyond his left shoulder. He took a deep breath and then stepped directly into her eyeline. Her gaze didn't flicker. She was looking at him, but not looking at him. He moved closer. Closer. She disappeared. Later in bed, he said, "I think we should turn the back bedroom into the nursery." He sensed Diane's body stiffen. Why? Because it's a nicer room. It looks out over the back garden, which means it'll be quieter too. Plus, it's next to the bathroom, which will be more convenient. She grunted like an exasperated warthog. "We've already decided where Abby's going." "You've decided, you mean? But it's not set in stone, is it? We can change our minds." "I want Abby next door to us, where we can hear her." "We'll be able to hear her wherever she is. It's not exactly the biggest house in the world." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing, I'm just saying." "Well, don't." Matt sighed inwardly. After a moment, he said, "It's just that room next door, it's got a funny atmosphere." She twisted round so quickly that he thought she was going to slap him. "What?" He felt the familiar sinking feeling he got whenever he was losing an argument. "It's just something about it doesn't feel right. It gives me the creeps." It was dark, but he sensed Diane staring at him, her expression scornful. "You're pathetic," she said eventually, and at that moment Abigail, in the cot at the end of their bed, began to cry. "Now see what you've done." The following week, at Diane's insistence, Matt decorated the nursery. The whole time he was in there, putting up yellow wallpaper with teddy bears on it, the girl sat silently on her chair, staring into space. Whenever he was forced to turn his back on her, Matt got an itch between his shoulder blades. He kept imagining her rising slowly to her feet, crossing the room towards him in short, jerky strides. And even if he was halfway up a ladder, he would twist his head, convinced that the girl would be standing right behind him. But she never was. On each occasion, she was still sitting on her chair, as motionless as ever. Her manner was innocuous. There was even something forlorn about her, and yet her presence filled him with such dread that sometimes he could barely breathe. He spoke to her frequently, sometimes calmly, sometimes with a hissing vehemence born of fear. Again and again he would ask her who she was, why she was here, what she wanted. He would plead with her to go away and leave them alone, or simply snarl at her to fuck off. Sometimes he would say, "If you do anything to hurt my family," before spluttering impotently into silence. After a while, the simple knowledge that she was there in the house with them began to wear him down. At night he wouldn't sleep. He would listen for the slightest scrape of movement through the wall. And whatever room he was in, he would always be aware of her presence. She was like a darkness, a tumour embedded in the body of the house. Matt lost his appetite, became thinner, grew twitchy and nervous. Preoccupied with Abigail and with befriending their new neighbours, Diane didn't even notice. After a month or so, Abby moved out of their room and into her new nursery. She slept in her cot against one wall, and the girl sat on her chair against the other. Matt would spend as much time as he could without arousing Diane's suspicions in the room with his daughter. He would slump against the wall by her cot and stare balefully across the room at the girl, keeping guard. But he couldn't be there all the time. and when Abby and the girl were alone together, Matt would feel anxiety gnawing at him. He would obsessively watch the baby monitor jump up at the slightest sound or the merest flicker from the row of green lights beneath the little speaker. He would pretend he needed a pee just so that he could run upstairs and check on his daughter. And each time, the girl would be sitting on her chair, hands on knees, staring. Matt tried to find out who she was. He thought that if he could do that, then maybe he could exorcise her, lay her to rest. He went to the local library, scoured the internet, but found nothing. There had never been a house or a church or a school on this site, never been an accident or a murder. For hundreds of years, this had been farmland, and before that, forest. The girl was an anomaly. She shouldn't be here. He told her so. "You've got no right to be in my house," he said. "Why don't you just go away?" No response. She just sat and stared. 6 weeks after they'd moved in, Diane announced, "I'm going out with Sandra and the girls." It was a Wednesday night. Matt was hunched forward on the settee, eyes flickering between the TV and the baby monitor on the sideboard. He had no idea what he was watching. Sleeplessness and stress had turned his brain to cement. He looked up, blinking. "What?" Diane rolled her eyes. "Why don't you get a grip? I said I'm going out with Sandra." "Who's Sandra?" "Oh, for fuck's sake, she lives at number 12. Her husband's the golfer." She said this as though he ought to know. Matt let it slide. "What about Abigail?" "She'll be fine. Milk's in the fridge. You'll just have to warm her bottle. Not too hot, though. See you later." Then she was gone, in a whirlwind of flowery perfume. As soon as the front door slammed, Matt scuttled upstairs. He entered the dimly lit nursery and slumped down against the wall beside the cot. Abby was sleeping peacefully. The girl was in her usual position. Matt drew up his knees and stared at the girl. Time passed. The silence was dense, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. He didn't realise he'd fallen asleep until Abby started grizzling. His eyes snapped open in sudden panic, but the girl was still there, unmoving. Wearily, Matt rose to his feet, picked up his daughter and tried to calm her. But she was restless, pushing her tiny fists into her mouth. "All right," he said, putting her carefully back into her cot and glancing across the room at the girl. "I'll get your bottle." He ran downstairs, heart pounding, hating the thought of leaving Abby alone with the girl. It wasn't until he had plonked the bottle in a pan of hot water in the kitchen and was moving from foot to foot, waiting for it to warm through, that it occurred to him to wonder why he hadn't just brought Abby down with him. Was he unable to think straight because he was exhausted, or because the girl was exerting some kind of malign influence over him? Snatching the bottle from the pan, he ran into the hallway. Above his head, a floorboard creaked. "No!" he shouted, scrambling up the stairs. Reaching the top, he leapt across the landing, into the nursery. His eyes darted to where the girl was sitting. Except that she wasn't there. Her chair was empty. And then he detected movement on the other side of the cot. His head twisted so sharply that pain burst in his skull like a firework. Through a cluster of falling stars, he saw the girl bent over the cot, both arms reaching inside. "No!" Matt shouted again, and for the first time the girl seemed to hear him. She looked up, and on her face was an expression of terrible regret. "Sorry, Daddy," she whispered. "Get away from her!" Matt screamed, and plunged towards her, hands outstretched. As ever, when he got to within a metre of the girl, she smeared out of existence. Falling against the side of the cot, Matt looked down. Abby was lying on her back, arms up beside her head. She was very still, and her face was already turning blue. Matt lifted her up and cradled her, smothering her with his warmth. "Wake up," he whispered. "Wake up, wake up, wake up!" He repeated the words, over and over, for the next hour. Finally, he raised his head, which felt heavy as a boulder, and looked across the room. The girl was back in her usual place on her chair against the wall. Matt knew she would always be there for him now, no matter where he went. There you go. A cheery little tale for you. So, yes, thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all keeping well and that you're all getting through this very, very weird, well, the last part of this very, very weird year. Okay. It'll soon be Christmas, and again, like everything else this year, it's going to be a weird one. I hope that you're spending time with people that you care about and that you're getting in touch with the people you care about with. A lot of us are having to isolate just to keep our heads down, and it's tough, but I hope we'll all get through this. Hold fast and all the rest. So, having said all that, hi, my name is Simon Bestwick. I want to say a big thanks to Joe Freeman for inviting me to be a part of this thing here. I'm a writer of horror fiction and related stuff. I've published 6 novels so far. Tide of Souls, The Faceless, The Feast of All Souls. Souls seem to pop up a lot in my stuff. And the 3 books so far in the Black Road series, Hell's Ditch, Devil's Highway and Wolf's Hill. That's set in the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust and then throws supernatural horror into the mix. So, you know, it's really cheerful, that one. Might actually give you a nice change of scenery given all that's going on at the moment. So that's kind of stuff I write, mostly horror, and it's sort of evil twins like dark fantasy and what have you. My most recent book is this. It's called Rothsteyer, which is out from Steve Shaw's Black Shuck Books, and that's the story of an immortal lesbian assassin who now works as a morgue attendant in Manchester, as you do, and finds her past catching up with her in the form of an antique pistol called a Rothsteyer, hence the title. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about or to read to you from. Just giving a quick plug to it there. Now, tonight's story comes from this beautifully done book, and Cannot Come Again, which is my collection of my short stories that was released earlier this year from Horrific Tales, with fantastic cover art by Ben Baldwin. It's a collection of 17 short stories and novelettes and novellas. Some of it going back to the very beginning of my career. And it's also got an introduction from Ramsey Campbell, which is sort of something off my personal bucket list. So you can get this from Horrific Tales in ebook as well as in hard copy, and that's all the sales pitching I'm going to do. The story I'm going to read is called In the Shelter, and it's never been published outside of this collection, so this is the only place you can actually read it, which is true of some of the other stories here as well. So without further ado, I'll get on with it. Once I've found the story, I will get on with it, because that's what you're here for, isn't it? Okay. In the Shelter by Simon Bestwick. Dean slammed the steel door and shot the bolt across, then stumbled down the metal staircase. The bomb shelter was 20 feet below the street surface and about as many square. Just below ceiling level, inside protective cages of steel mesh, electric lights cast a cold and clinical glow over tiled white walls with wooden bench seats running round them. Above, muffled but still horribly loud, the sirens continued to wail. No bombs had fallen yet. It might be a false alarm, and the all clear would sound at any moment. Otherwise, there was no predicting how long he'd be down here. If they were using conventional explosives, it would be over quickly enough. He tried not to think of the firestorm incendiary bombs might create, or how he might cook or suffocate if that happened. If the bombs were gas or radiological, he could be down here for days. And I didn't even bring a good book, he muttered, and snorted to himself. It was cold. Dean pulled his knees up to his chest and hunched up as tightly as he could on the bench. He'd only been caught out during a raid once before, and that time he'd ended up in one of the bigger shelters, part of a larger group. Sing-songs in the shelters might be considered cheap sentiment and easy camaraderie, but the companionship had at least been a welcome distraction from the thought of what was happening outside. But in here, he was at least sealed and safe. A soft shiver ran through the bench, and for a second the lights above flickered. The next impact, or rather impacts, came a second later and were much closer. Sharper and louder too, and they came from the shelter door. "Let us in!" a muffled voice shouted, a woman's. "For God's sake, open the door!" Dean jumped as the door rattled in its frame. It was supposed to be an airtight seal. "Open the door!" a second woman. She was shouting too, but her voice was deeper and steadier, in control, determined. "Whoever's down there, please, let us in." Dean half stirred, but then the seat shuddered under him again, and the lights flickered once more. Another bomb. Closer, too. "Please!" the first woman screamed. "You've got kids with us! Please!" Another shuddering impact, and this time the lights flickering was accompanied by the hiss and patter of falling dust. Giant's footsteps plodding their relentless way towards him. "Come on!" the second woman shouted and thumped angrily on the door. "Are you trying to get us killed or something?" Were there really children with them? Dean couldn't hear any. It might be a play for sympathy, trying to persuade him to let them in. But why shouldn't he? Was he that much of a coward? Angrily, he stood up and strode across the floor to the foot of the steps. It would take a second to let them in, and then they'd be together. He wouldn't be alone, however long the raid lasted, however long it took for the all clear to sound. He wouldn't be alone. "Coming!" he shouted, and climbed the steps, swaying for balance as another bomb, closer still, shook the earth. Not to worry, because it would take seconds to unlock the door. Then he'd shut it behind his new companions, the two women and the children they might or might not have, and not open it again no matter what they heard. "Thank you," he heard the first woman sobbing with relief. "Thank you." "It's all right, Mum," said a new voice. It sounded like a young boy, perhaps in his early teens. "We'll be safe in a mo." Dean could hear children crying as they reached the door, so it hadn't been a lie. "Okay," he called, "I'm going to let you in now." His hand was on the bolt when the sirens changed their tune. Literally so. The slow rising and falling wail now became a rapid klaxon-like blaring. Dean froze. No. It couldn't be, but the sound didn't stop. He stared at the laminated guide sheet fixed beside the door, read and reread it in the hope of seeing something different, but it was the same every time. 3 long notes repeated over and over meant the bombs had been identified as conventional explosive. A continuous series of short notes meant radiological attack. The klaxon. Nerve gas. "Oh, God," he heard the first woman say in a tiny voice, and he knew that she, too, had understood what it meant. "Come on," the second woman said, then thumped the door. "Come on, will you open up? It's a public shelter. We've a right to get in." The ground shuddered again and then again. Louder each time and closer. Was the gas already in the air? If he opened the door, would it get in? They were still unharmed, so if they were safe, so should he be. But how long did it take for the symptoms to appear? "Hey!" It was the boy shouting. "Open up, you—" Then his voice was muffled. Don't! Dean heard the first woman hiss, then louder, "Please, whoever you are, let us in." Dean could hear other children crying out there, younger children, girls. The ground shuddered again, very close this time. The giant had stamped its way almost on top of the shelter. "I'm begging you," the second woman said. Her voice was close to the door. She was keeping it as level as she possibly could. "I'm begging you, mate. Please let us in. If not for us, then at least for the kids." Dean reached for the bolt. All he had to do was pull it back, and that would be it. In they'd come. Then seal the hatch again and wait, sing together in the dark until it was almost clear, until help came. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't. And then they began to scream. "Oh God, let us in, let us in!" But then the screams cut off, and instead there was an appalling whooping and wheezing sound, lungs struggling to draw breath. He backed away, almost overbalanced at the top of the steps. He had to pinwheel his arms madly to keep his balance. But he gripped the rails on either side of the steps and clambered down, and then he ran headlong back across the shelter to the bench that was furthest from the door. But even so, the wheezing and choking from outside followed him, and it shouldn't have been able to. Not through the steel hatch and all that distance. The awful sound of their struggling to breathe, it couldn't have been that loud. But nonetheless he heard it, every moment of it, every note. Even as it faded and wound down, he could still hear it. Right up until the moment that 3 bombs burst, one after the other, seemingly almost on top of the shelter. He thought again of a giant trampling on the city, and imagined it slamming its foot down again and again to cut off those agonized sounds. After that, there was only silence, but for the muted crackle of flames. Those last few bombs must have been conventional ones that had probably come as a mercy to them, of a kind. He could still hear the sirens, but much more faintly. Perhaps the one that was closest to him had been knocked out. It didn't matter. Dean hunched up on the bench, hugging his knees and fighting back tears. He had no right to shed them. If he hadn't hesitated, hadn't been such a bloody coward, he would have had them inside long before the klaxon had sounded, certainly long before the gas could have reached them. And now they were dead. He covered his eyes. Time passed, he wasn't sure how much. The sirens had stopped now, but no all clear sounded. If there'd been nerve gas, it might be hours before the area could be decontaminated. A long time to sit, alone with his thoughts and his conscience. He'd done what he had to. He had, in order to survive. The lights flickered as another bomb thumped down nearby. Not as close as those last 3, though. Perhaps the raid was already passing. It didn't take long to drop a bomb, after all. Everything could change in minutes, seconds, from life to death. You could, in that space of time, become a murderer without doing a single thing. The lights flickered again, and Dean curled upon himself on the bench and tried not to cry. He wasn't very successful any more than he was in his efforts not to picture the people who died outside his door. Had the women been a couple, he could picture it. The first woman tall and willowy, long-haired and pre-Raphaelite in looks. The second one stockier, short-haired in jeans and leather jacket with a kind, handsome face. The boy, perhaps 14, thin with black hair dangling perpetually over his eyes, probably with a keychain hanging from his waist and a black t-shirt with some suitably nihilistic slogan upon it. And what about the girls? Twins, his imagination decided. Tiny and blonde, about 5 years old, and dressed for some reason in pink tutus. Perhaps they'd just been collected from ballet practice. Dean shoved his fist into his mouth because the thought had set him off laughing, and it was wrong to laugh, horribly wrong, after what had happened, with the bombs still falling all around, the giant stamping its feet. That, and because the sound of his own laughter, high-pitched and jagged, had frightened him. He could hear the madness in it. The giant slammed its foot down brutally hard, and nowhere near as far away as the last few explosions had been. The shelter lights flickered again, violently, and more dust, this time mixed with chips of plaster, rained down onto the tiled floor. And that was the only sound he'd heard. He had most definitely not, heard anything rustling from the direction of the bench to his right. He couldn't have, because when he looked, there was nothing and no one there. Probably just a little dust, he told himself, falling on the bench. But when the light flickered again, something moved in Dean's peripheral vision, and he jerked his head around. No. Nothing again. He could feel tiny movements at the corners of his eyes, his pulse throbbing. That was what he'd seen. Nothing more. Dust. Nothing but dust and an accelerated heart rate, perhaps a little high blood pressure. He should see his doctor about it. Dean climbed off the seat, suddenly restless, and paced about the shelter. Then he went to inspect the bench to the right of where he'd been sitting. He couldn't see any dust. He swept the flat of his hand across the surface of the bench, but didn't encounter any grittiness. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't. What had happened was horrible, but it hadn't been his choice. His only choice had been not to act, not to answer the door. Surely that was culpable enough. No, he hadn't created the situation. He hadn't dropped the bombs. As if prompted by that thought, another bomb fell, and again the giant's foot seemed to slam down just outside his door, shaking the shelter so hard that Dean almost lost his balance and fell. The lights flickered again, and as he steadied himself against the wall, there was no mistaking the sound of movement behind him. But once again, when he whirled around, there was nothing and no one in sight. This was ridiculous. His lips were dry. He licked them. He was being stupid. His breathing was short and ragged, and he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. This was guilt and nothing more. Guilt and stress. I did what I had to do. He said it out loud. Nothing he hadn't already been thinking, but perhaps if he said it aloud, it would become real and sink in. It was the only rational option. If I'd opened the door, the gas would have killed me too. I didn't want to leave you outside, leave them outside. There wasn't any malice in it, but there was nothing else I could do. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I had to. This time the light flickered without the accompanying thump of a bomb. The rustling again. Rats in the walls, that was all it could be. You were never more than 10 feet from a rat, or so the saying went. Dean had never been sure if that had been true or an urban myth, but he was happy to believe it for now. He'd made a good argument, and it might even be true. But he didn't believe it. It didn't convince or move him, so how could he expect it to do the same for anyone else? But it didn't have to, did it? He was alone down here. There wasn't anyone to hear, there wasn't. He was the only one who knew what had happened. There'd been no witnesses, no living witnesses. Dean shook his head. Even that made him sound like a criminal, and he wasn't. He wasn't. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't done anything. But then again, wasn't that the point? No, once again. He was not a criminal. He wasn't a killer. He was a victim of circumstance. That was all. The same as those poor people outside. God, when the raid was over, when he had to leave the shelter, he'd see what was left of them. Surely that would be punishment enough. No, not punishment. Again, that was how a criminal thought. Guilt. He felt guilt. Of course he did. No decent person could be involved in something like this and not feel guilt. But didn't that prove he was a decent person, that he wasn't a murderer? He shook his head again and rubbed his face as though to shock himself awake. He would drive himself mad like this, alone with his thoughts. That would be the hard part, getting through the hours until the all clear sounded. But the bombs were all that could harm him. Nothing could get in from outside. Nothing and no one. Of course, you could argue that once you were dead, locked doors were no longer a barrier. But even if he didn't dismiss that whole idea as absurd, and he did, of course he did, because when you were dead, and there was nothing else. But even if he didn't, why would there be any need to get into the shelter anymore? You wouldn't have to worry about the bombs or the gas any longer, or about radiation or fire. But, of course, just as no harm could come to you now, nor could any good. And if you had children and you'd just seen them cheated of so much that had lain ahead, cheated by one man's cowardice and timidity, you might have other very different reasons for wanting to get into the place where he hid. If you still existed, of course. If Dean, even for a moment, was willing to countenance the possibility of such a thing, which he didn't. Not even for a moment. And yet. But the responsibility wasn't his. It lay with the men who gave the orders, the men who dropped the bombs. They were the ones who'd condemned that family to death, along with so many others. Even so, they hadn't had to die. The simple act of pulling back a bolt might have saved them, and without any risk to himself, if he'd done it before the gas alert had sounded. Above, the giant was still trampling on the city. Inside the shelter, the lights flickered again, and Dean saw another shadow beside his on the floor. A very thin shadow, he thought as he turned. He breathed out in relief when he saw nothing there. The next bomb sounded even closer than the rest, as though it had landed directly overhead. It couldn't have, of course, or the roof would have been blown in on him. But more dust fell down and formed a haze in the light, and alongside the rumbling and the falling of the dust, he heard the rustling return. The rustling and something else. A low muttering sound. He couldn't decide if it was one voice or several. It seemed to come from all around him, but that could have been a trick of the acoustics. It was in his head, nowhere else. He only had to endure a little longer, remind himself that whatever he saw or heard were just hallucinations, born of fear and stress and guilt, unnecessary guilt. No one else ever had to know what had happened here. It would be his secret, something he would carry with him and try to forget. He would live with it, and in time it would fade. It would be like an old wound, one that had healed over a piece of shrapnel the doctors couldn't remove. Occasional twinges of discomfort, but nothing else. He'd live with it, and he would go on. Something touched Dean's hand, and he was unable to hold back a cry. He spun around towards what had touched him, and he saw it, or he almost did, but closed his eyes at the last moment. Through his eyelids he saw the light's glow flicker on and off again, and refused to open them. He wouldn't look again. He wouldn't. But now something muttered in his ear, and now it stroked his cheek. He broke away with another cry, flailing about him. The edge of the bench caught the back of his thighs, and he fell back into his seat. The light flickered and flickered and flickered. It no longer seemed connected with the distant thump of the falling bombs. Again the muttering sounded, the flickering stopped, and the lights flared back to their full strength. The explosions were still sounding, but they were far away now. The raid at last was receding. Dean strained to listen, but he could hear nothing. Very, very slowly, almost unwillingly, he forced his eyes open. He saw only the tiled walls and floor and the benches littered with fallen dust. His heart was thumping so violently he gasped for breath. He clasped his hands together in front of him. His imagination. Nothing else. Just that. His hands clutched and rubbed one another, damp with sweat. He tried to rub the perspiration off on his trousers. When he looked at his hands, they were strangely grimy, as if there'd been something on them, or one of them, some dirt, some taint. His cheeks stung where he'd been touched, except, of course, that he hadn't been touched. He'd imagined it. But nonetheless, he reached up to investigate it, and his fingers found something there. It felt like a sort of sticky dust. When he looked at them, his fingers were covered with black, greasy soot. He didn't like to contemplate where the grease might have originated. The light flickered again, and when it came back on, he was no longer alone. He only saw it for a moment before the light went back out. It was a small figure. It might have been larger once, but now it was blackened and charred and shrunken down. When the darkness returned, Dean could still see two discs of pale yellowish light where the thing's eyes, or what had been its eyes, had been. When the light came back on, the shelter was empty again. He was dimly aware of having made a sound, but he wasn't sure what kind. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. The shelter seemed to spin around him, and he felt as though he were tumbling end over end, head over heels, endlessly, all while he sat on the bench. "It wasn't my fault," he said. The sound of his own voice disgusted him. It was weak and whimpering, a whining plea. It wasn't. The explosions were very distant now, but they hadn't completely ceased. The light flickered again. For a moment it went out entirely, and now he could see 5 pairs of glowing eyes. And then it returned to show him what had crept closer when it had gone out, what had gathered form and substance in the darkness. Seeing one such figure had been bad enough, but all of them together was far, far worse, and the children worst of all. He squeezed his eyes shut and reopened them. However, the light this time was steady and strong, and what it revealed refused to be dispelled, but stood as real and solid as the hands he raised before him. He wasn't sure if he was trying to ward them off or to pray, but in either case, it was futile. Now they began to close in. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry." With a dull ping, the light blew out, and the darkness fell greedily, taking possession of the shelter for the last time. 5 pairs of yellowish lights rushed towards him, and Dean shut his own eyes tightly and put his hands over his face, shrinking back on the bench, trying to force himself through the wall behind him. Something both gritty and oily to the touch closed around each of his wrists and prized his hands away. He tried to convince himself that they might only want him to witness what they'd become, to acknowledge at last his guilt, as their charred, brittle fingers scratched across his face, searching for his eyes. Okay, so that's the story. I really hope you enjoyed that. As I say, I hope you will have the best possible Christmas anyone can have in this very weird ending to a very weird year. Thank you all for watching and for tuning in to see this, and all the very best to you. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Let